We have Nathan Massie, who serves as the associate pastor for Oregon Church of God, a biblical Unitarian church in Oregon, Illinois. He holds a bachelor's degree from Atlanta Bible College and has served as an adult Sunday school teacher, worship leader, and youth pastor in the church where he grew up, right here at Lawrenceville Church of God in Springfield, Ohio. It's nice when the home team's here. Nathan met his wife, Sarah, while pastoring in Oregon, and they continue to serve their community as well as support national efforts such as the Church of God General Conference and the UCA. Please help me welcome Nathan Massie.
Thank you very much. It is an honor to be here, as Brandon said, in my home church, filling my pulpit. But if I were to normally preach a sermon that has a title looks anything like this, people would zone out pretty immediately. So I'm thankful you're here. Today we're going to be talking about Ignatius of Antioch and the importance of second century writings and the development of philosophy and different theologies over the first couple hundred years of the church. But I wanted to start out by telling you how I got interested in this topic. I was reading a book by somebody that you may have heard of named James White called The Forgotten Trinity, and I did that for a specific reason. If you are dealing with Trinitarians and you want to speak to them in a language that they understand, you want to face people who, are respected in their community. And no matter what your opinion of James White is, he's a popular internet theologian, and his book, Forgotten Trinity, was pretty well received. So I read the book, and it was pretty standard stuff, things that you would expect to see, until the end of the book where he begins to quote church fathers as being proto-Trinitarian or ante-Nicene Trinitarian. And that was a curveball to me. That was something that I never really interacted with before. And so pretty much as soon as I finished the book, I went to Amazon and put this in my cart. And this is my copy of the Apostolic Fathers, Greek texts and English translations, the 3rd edition. And I began to work through it. And so I read 1st and 2nd Clement, not really any problem at all. When I got to Ignatius, there were some pretty significant issues. And that was a big curveball that was thrown to me. I was not anticipating that by any means. So I began to study it, and a year and a half later, here I am presenting to you some of my findings. So, why study Ignatius of Antioch? Well, the first reason is this. Ignatius lived in the Subapostolic age. And that's just fancy lingo for the time immediately after the apostles. The new responsibilities of church leadership were being passed to the second or maybe even third generation, and that's where Ignatius finds himself. So Ignatius, being such an early author in this immediate time after the apostles, means that it's important to consider at least what he has to say, since he is the very early church. And secondly, studying historical church writings gives us clues as to the development of doctrine and practice in the early church. With this being marked around 120 AD, give or take a few years, this is really important for us to see how the church then branched out and began to develop different topics, philosophies, and theologies. So, right off the top, what can we glean from Ignatius? Well, I think there are going to be two things that we're really going to glean from this. The first is what a second century church leader taught concerning the relationship between God and Jesus. It doesn't hold the authority of the New Testament, but being so shortly after, it's important to see when the philosophy and theology began to change, because we can all agree that in the first 300 to 400 years of the church, Christology and theology changed quite drastically. So if we could pinpoint when we can start to see these transformations, it gives us a lot of insight. And secondly, a look into the hierarchical structure of the ancient church. Now, we're not going to spend as much time on that. We will talk about it very briefly, but we're primarily going to be focusing on the relationship between Jesus and God from a second century perspective. So at this time, I want to break down a little bit how this is going to go. One, I'm going to have to spend about 20 minutes or so developing the history so we can all be on a more equal playing field. After that, I'm going to criticize some of the mainstream theories that have stood for about 140 years or so. And then after that, we're going to actually take a look into the Ignatius text and compare Christologies between the different versions of the text. So, the first question we're going to ask, how many letters of Ignatius are there? Well, this is actually a bit of a loaded question, but the answer is there are 14 letters attributed to Ignatius, 17 total in the corpus. So it's important to separate these letters based on a few criteria. First of which, are the links to the letters. These are referred to as recensions. In fact, Sean referred to this morning. Recensions is just a fancy way of saying links. There's the short, middle, and long recension, and as you would probably assume, the short is the shortest version of the text, the middle is halfway between short and long is the longest. So there are 3 different recensions to this, but also the letter manuscripts are found in 6 different languages: Syriac, Greek, Latin, Armenian, Coptic, and Arabic. It means we have a lot of details to kind of wade through when it comes to Ignatius scholarship. Thankfully, though, a lot of the groundwork has already been laid out by those who have gone before us. So these are all the letters associated with Ignatius. Now, you might recognize some of these letters because some of the same churches that existed during the time of the Apostle Paul have letters that are written to them, allegedly, such as the Philippians or the Ephesians. Maybe one that you don't recognize is the Magnesians, or the Tarsians, or the Antiochenes, or even Hero, which is actually a person, probably one of the coolest names, Acts of Martyrdom, etc. But you'll also notice at the very bottom of it, 14, 15, 16, 17, Ignatius to John the Evangelist, that is John, the Apostle John, Ignatius to John the Evangelist second time around, and then Ignatius to St. Mary, that is the mother of the Lord Jesus. So we're going to see very quickly that not all of these letters were written by Ignatius, but this is the corpus as a whole. When it comes to talking about the recension, here are the 3 recensions, and this is the reason I have a headset on, because I have a laser pointer, good for cats and pastors. And here we see in the different recensions, this is the shortest version of it, this is the middle version of it, and this is the long version. I color-coded it this way to show the relationship between the 3 recensions. If it's in green, it means that it's in all 3 recensions. So Polycarp, Ephesians, and Romans are on all 3 short, middle, and long recensions. If it's in yellow, it means that it's only in the middle and long recension: Magnesians, Trallians, Philadelphians, and Smyrnaeans. And then finally, the long recension in the blue, those are things that are only found in the long recension. And I will say this right out the bat, that everything that's found in the color blue, I have not really found any scholars that try to vet these as actual letters, but are medieval forgeries, all written in Latin. So our primary focus today is really going to be between the relationship between the short and the middle recension. So the first part of this is we're going to take a look at the transmission history, how the letters of Ignatius were, how they traveled through time, how they were interacted with the public, and eventually how the scholarship on Ignatius began. So the first one is this: in 1495, 3 spurious Latin Ignatian letters were published. And these, of course, were the letters, the first letter to the Apostle John, the second letter to the Apostle John, and a third letter from the Virgin Mary. These were all pseudepigraphal, spurious texts. Nobody gives any ground to them. But it was the first time that the public had ever dealt with Ignatius at all. And in 1557, a man by the pseudonym Valentinus Passius published a collection of 12 Ignatian epistles. Now, Valentinus Passius is a pretty cool name. His real name was actually Hartung Fried, so I could see why he wanted to switch it to Valentinus Passius. But when it came to dealing with these, when he published the letters, it included some of the letters that had already been published, and it included some of the other letters that are in the corpus as a whole. So in really 50 or 60 years, a lot of Ignatius material started being put out to the public. In 1623, the pioneer of Ignatian textual criticism by the name of Nicholas Videlius began his work. His goal was to do 2 things. The first thing was to wade through the material, to be able to set them up, or to set the letters as either spurious, which means totally false, or authentic. That was his first goal. And his second goal was to really set up a means of this textual criticism. And he was really the pioneer of this. He had seen the letters circulating, and he just knew that he wanted to set it straight. So his work was a turning point, really, for 2 reasons. The first is he discovered what would later be known as the middle recension of the Greek text. And not jumping quite ahead of myself yet, but this is what still stands today as the the scholarly consensus of what's authentic Ignatius. If you go and buy your own copy of Apostolic Fathers, which I would encourage you to do, you can get it on Amazon. If you look at it and go through it, it's all going to be based on the middle recension. And so his discovery was important because it would actually later become the scholastic consensus for the last 140 years now. And secondly, he set the stage for critical scholarship for Ignatius. So we really owe Nicholas Fidelius a lot of credit for beginning this particular conversation. In the mid-19th century, William Curitin discovered a letter of Ignatius in Syriac from an Egyptian monastery. And so this was a really important discovery because this is going to be the first letter of the short recension that is found. William Curitin was besides being a chaplain in ordinary to Queen Victoria, he was a curator and a trustee to the British Museum. So this discovery was huge because it was the first time anybody had seen any Ignatius material in Syriac, and it would also be recognized as the shortest of the three recensions. So after he discovered this, he's like, whoa, this is Ignatius. We need to see if there's more of this out there. A second exhibition to the Egyptian monastery would find 2 additional letters completing what would be known as the 3LC, or the 3-letter collection, the short recension. So Curitin's conclusion after, first he had to learn Syriac, and then after learning Syriac and translating the material, his conclusion was this, that the 3-letter collection, or the short recension, were the authentic letters of Ignatius, and all other letters were interpolated to one degree or another. In other words, the shortest version of the letters are the most authentic, and everything else has some interpolations, which means additions to the text that occurred at a later point. In fact, this is what William Curitin had to say about it, or what Dr. Given argues from William Curitin's perspective. He says this, Curitin argues that the preference for the Syriac version is not only the epistemologically safe bet, it is the only critically responsible choice. If you are dealing with a text that you know has some issues with it, then the epistemologically safe bet would be dealing with the text that has the fewest issues. And most scholars agree that the Syriac text has the fewest issues. It has the fewest interpolations to the text. And so this is really the theory that drove Curitin's point concerning Ignatius. Then, after the death of Curitin, before the death of Curitin, his hypothesis would actually stand as the scholastic consensus until after his death. He didn't live long enough to see his own ideas become kind of secondary in the light of mainstream scholastic consensus. But J.B. Lightfoot, who is a really big name when it comes to historiography, is really who has established the scholarly consensus for the last 140 years concerning this text and the middle recension, defending that as his position. And we're going to take some time to actually critique Lightfoot's position, and it's important to do so because if he has this scholarly consensus, I can't just say he's wrong and move on. I have to show why I think he's wrong. So when it comes to J.B. Lightfoot, in the latter part of the 19th century, after the death of Curitin, the tides of consensus changed with Theodore Zahn and J.B. Lightfoot. Theodore Zahn helped J.B. Lightfoot out considerably. They worked together on the Ignatius text. And his conclusion is, of course, that the 7-letter collection of the Greek middle recension were the authentic letters of Ignatius. So we're going to spend some time critiquing Lightfoot's theory. There are some holes in it. Lightfoot was an excellent historiographer. He was an excellent scholar, but his name sometimes carried too much weight. And even if he submitted a point that didn't quite make sense or didn't quite stand up to reason, people would just kind of accept it because he was J.B. Lightfoot. And so the first one is this. The 7-letter collection was never found as a standalone corpus, but always found with other letters that Lightfoot would call spurious. So if he's saying, this is my idea that the 7-letter collection in the middle recension is absolutely correct, this is absolutely authentic Ignatius, well, why is it never found as a standalone set? It's always found with more or fewer letters. It's never found by itself. In fact, the closest that it gets is 6 letters. Other than that, every other corpus that's found, or manuscript set that's found with the seven-letter collection always has many more letters that definitely have spurious text to them. So it gives us at least a pause for a moment to think about this as a whole. Why is it never found as a standalone set, but it's always more or less than what he has to say? Secondly, Lightfoot's theory asserts that the seven-letter collection was abbreviated into the three-letter collection for monastic purposes. In fact, if you pick up a copy of his book, it just says this line, and that's pretty much it. He actually cites Theodore Zahn for this, but it's really unsatisfying when it comes to, I would like to know how you came up to that conclusion. Well, that's my conclusion. Thank you for coming. That's essentially what he does. So Lightfoot's theory is that the seven-letter collection was torn apart, broken down, and abbreviated for monastic purposes. Well, my first question is this: why would a monk whose primary job is to secure texts, ancient writings, why would they be tearing these apart and kind of smashing them down when what we see most often in history is that letters tend to get longer, not shorter? And so his idea that they were kind of contorted, redacted, and smashed into this nice little package for monastic purposes, it doesn't really make sense. Because, in fact, when Curitin discovers the three-letter collection, it actually comes from a pretty stark warning from the monks. It says this: "This book belongs to the monastery of Diapara of the desert seat of the Syrians. Whosoever," which apparently they had the King James, "whosoever taketh this book and taketh any fraudulent use of it, or taketh it out of the convent, or cutteth anything from it, or eraseth this memorial, may be he accursed and estranged from the holy church of God. Amen." Yeah, it's really weird. They had the King James 6 centuries early. But the point of this is that monks took their job seriously. And you could say, well, maybe they did it for theological reasons. Maybe they were theologically divergent. Well, most of what is, if you're with Lightfoot's theory of the seven-letter collection becoming the three-letter collection, most of what's taking out is high Christology. So you're telling me that 4th, 5th, 6th century monks are redacting their idea of the Trinity down into the three-letter collection? That doesn't really make sense, especially because with the collection that was found in Syria also contained sermons on the Trinity from St. Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa. So this wasn't for theological purposes, but Lightfoot just simply says it was for monastic purposes and moves on. The next point is this: that Lightfoot's theory hangs on the authority of a 4th century writer, historian, Eusebius, because Eusebius quotes the seven-letter collection as the writings of Ignatius. In fact, the first time that we see the seven-letter collection being quoted as official Ignatius is in the 4th century by Eusebius. And he actually lists the letters out in order that I had showed you before. And so Lightfoot says that Eusebius is such a reliable authority that we can take what he says at face value, that this is authentic Ignatius. Well, one of the problems with that is Eusebius lives about 200 years after the time of Ignatius. I'm not saying that it's impossible for this to be the case, but to say that this external witness is the definitive case when there are actually earlier witnesses that refer to Ignatius, I don't think Eusebius is necessarily the best choice, because the other external witnesses that are much earlier than Eusebius that actually quote Ignatius are Origen, Irenaeus, and Polycarp. And Lightfoot says, look, these are earlier people. This means that the seven-letter collection has to be the case. This has to be the original Ignatius. Well, here's the thing about every quote from Origen, Irenaeus, and Polycarp concerning Ignatius. All of the quotes that are found there can be found in the three-letter collection. So it doesn't really necessarily give primacy or weight to the seven-letter collection being authentic, where all the quotes are actually found in the three-letter collection as well. In fact, I think that gives more strength to the three-letter collection over the seven-letter collection. If a quote that can only be found in the seven-letter collection was mentioned by Origen, Irenaeus, or Polycarp, then that would give us some reason to believe that the seven-letter collection is the authentic one. But we can't. Every quote is found in the three-letter collection. Now, here are some comments that Lightfoot actually makes concerning the Syriac version, the shortest version of the text. Lightfoot grants that the earliest records we have on Ignatian epistles are found in the three-letter collection. The absolute earliest manuscripts that there are found in the three-letter collection. Lightfoot states this: the Syriac version would therefore have been invaluable as an independent check if we had possessed it entirely, since it could not have been made later than the 4th or 5th century, and would have exhibited the text much nearer to the fountainhead than either the Greek or Latin. In other words, if we had the Syriac version, all 7 letters, it would be invaluable. But since I know that the 7-letter collection is authentic, and there are only 3 letters in the shortest version, therefore we can't even use it as an authority. He says it would have been invaluable as an independent check had we possessed it entirely, but it never occurs to him, what if the 3-letter collection were the only texts, were the original text, and the 7-letter collection was expanded upon the 3-letter collection at a later time. In fact, Lightfoot even agreed for a short few years before he came up with his theory. He actually agreed with Puritans and then later abandoned it. He then says this: unfortunately, only a few fragments belonging to this version are preserved, but this defect is made up to a considerable extent. We have a rough abridgment or collection of letters from the Syriac version. So he says, look, it's the earliest manuscripts that we have. There's only 3 of them. We can't do anything with this because it doesn't include the whole 7-letter collection. This is an excellent example of circular reasoning. Since I know this is true and this contradicts it, then that can't be true because I already know what's true. Did you follow that? Okay. When Lightfoot, and this, in my opinion, is the fatal blow of Lightfoot's position. When Lightfoot produces his own translation of the 7-letter collection, he pulls from all available Greek and Latin texts, both from the middle and long recension, and champions his product as the authentic Ignatian epistles. When you pick up a copy of Apostolic Fathers, you are not just getting the Greek middle recension. You're getting the Greek long recension. You're getting some of the Latin middle recension. You're getting some of the Latin long recension. He makes essentially a Frankenstein of text, taking a little bit from here and a little bit from here and a little bit from here and putting it together and calling it a faithful 2nd century set of documents. That is not epistemologically safe, as Puritan would put it. That is not a safe bet to have this eclectic group of texts all pulled from different sources and put together and calling it an authentic text. In fact, as Dr. Gregory Given points out in his dissertation, the chimerical, genuine text of Ignatius's letters were synthesized out of a vast and heterogeneous set of data. This is not something that he's not just quoting or translating the 7-letter collection. He's pulling a little bit from each of the different recensions, and he is even, in fact, states at one point in his book that the long recension of the Greek text is sometimes more faithful than the middle recension. So he champions the middle recension, the 7-letter collection, as the champion text, and then actually abandons it almost altogether when he pulls all of the other data from the Latin and longer versions of the text. How could that possibly be a faithful reconstruction of a 2nd century set of documents when he pulls from known interpolated texts? It just doesn't really stand. Then, shortly and during the time of J.B. Lightfoot, we have Ferdinand Christian Bauer. He produced multiple works concluding that all Ignatian texts were a forgery, which he was not new in this. Many reformers found that to be the case as well. Because of this, the New Testament that Ignatius quotes could have been likely been produced in the 2nd century. Ferdinand Bauer really comes on the scene, and he is like a high critical German scholar. He has what's known as the Tübingen School of Thought, where he is extremely skeptical of New Testament scholarship and wants to date everything as late as possible. And so his goal really in contending with the Ignatian texts is to try to make the dating as late as possible, because for a long time, especially in early Christianity, Some of the best evidence that the canon of New Testament Scripture was found in the first century was actually citations from Ignatius. And when it comes to examining the seven-letter collection, there are a lot more New Testament quotations than in the short recension. In fact, there's only a handful in the short recension, one of which being a quote directly from Jesus, where Ignatius encourages the churches that he's writing to be as shrewd as a serpent. Say that 5 times fast. Shrewd as a serpent and as harmless as a dove. And so what would that mean? If it was early as possible, we can definitively put that quote of Jesus in the first century. And so Bauer's point is to make it as late as possible so that the New Testament loses some credibility. So because of this, Lightfoot, not only did Lightfoot feel that the authenticity and the canonicity of the New Testament were being challenged, but also his office as Bishop of Durham. Now, when I said in the beginning we're going to talk briefly about the hierarchical structure of the church and Ignatius, this is where this comes into play. In the seven-letter collection, you have this really well-thought-out division of offices, bishop, elder, and deacon, as in that hierarchy. Now, when the Apostle Paul refers to bishop, elder, and deacon, say in the book of Acts, he kind of uses them interchangeably. But in the seven-letter collection, it's actually laid out as a definitive group of 3 offices. In fact, it is the only time in the writings of Ignatius that are actually cited to legitimize the role of bishop. In fact, when the Church of England was going through some issues during the time of the Puritans, the people who were actually in the role of bishop would often quote Ignatius to make their points more legitimate that, hey, I'm a bishop, I should be here, look at this early Christian writer. When you look at the 3-letter collection, that distinction's not there. He uses it as the Apostle Paul does, kind of equating the offices, not necessarily having this tripartite division. So he feels that he has to have an earliest possible position to defend the canonicity of the New Testament, but also as his office as Bishop in Durham. With Bauer's criticism on the board, Lightfoot had more reason than ever to defend the earliest possible dating of Ignatian epistles as well as the 7-letter collection. There was a lot of pressure on Lightfoot, and I'm not saying by any means that Lightfoot was a bad scholar or anything like that, but I feel the pressure that was on him to defend not only Ignatius, but to feel that he's defending the Christian faith itself. There was just a lot of pressure on him, and I think it caused him to misstep. So that is really the transmission history and the foundation work of the textual criticism concerning Ignatius. Now we're going to look at new scholarship. So we're hopping from 1879 to 2019. A guy by the name of Marcus Vincent has kind of set out some new scholarship concerning Ignatius, and I find it very persuasive, and I'll share some of that in just a moment. There have been other attempts in the past, especially in the 20th century and some in the early 2000s, of people trying to criticize Lightfoot's opinions on Ignatius, but they all kind of fall apart. People are just happy to stay with the scholastic consensus. Have you ever dealt with that in any of your churches or friendships or anything like that? People like the status quo. It's really easy, instead of having to defend a position, that you just write, hey, Lightfoot did it, and you move on with your life. But Marcus Vincent is one who is not comfortable with doing that. Marcus Vincent is also the history chair at the King's College in London, and he's like emeritus professor and adjunct professor like 18 other places. It's crazy. But he takes a new and forensic approach to Ignatius by examining the language and word usage to see and comparing it between the 3-letter collection and the 7-letter collection. I'll pause for just a moment. Promise don't fall asleep. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, you're not going to, so. Okay, so we're going to look at some charts. Now, this is particularly nerve-wracking because I've never been in a position where I have to talk about Greek in front of 2 people who taught me Greek. So here we go. Okay, so there are terms, this is what he says in his book, There are terms particularly significant for a writer's style and the use of function words. And so what he's going to bring out in this small list here is that these are function words. These are particular words that are rare in the short recension, but abundant in the middle recension, a phenomenon that cannot be accounted for solely by the fact that the middle recension is longer and has 4 additional letters. So these are function words. We have a lot of these in the English language. Every language has a lot of them. And the disparity between the uses in the short recension and the middle recension cannot be only for the fact that the middle recension happens to be longer. And so we'll look at some of these right here. This is the Greek word alla, and it is a coordinating conjunction. It means but. And it shows up 2 times in the short recension, shows up 58 times in the middle recension. That's a big disparity. That's like that is huge. That cannot be just accounted for based on the difference in lengths. And then he goes on to say, with 5 times the combination of monon and alakai exclusively in the middle recension. So not only is alla used 56 more times in the middle recension than the short, but there are exclusive uses in the middle recension that do not show up in the short recension either time it shows up. That's kind of interesting. And there are some other words that are listed here too. For example, apostolos, which means apostle. In the short recension, it shows up once. In the middle recension, it shows up 14 times. But here is what is really important here, the bottom highlight part. Those are just pronouns. He, she, it, they, and not to be tongue-in-cheek, but you can see that there is a difference in preferred pronouns in between the short recension and the middle recension. The first one shows up twice, off 2, shows up in the middle recension 64 times. It shows up 62 more times. Alto, short recension once, middle recension 13 times. Alton, short recension once, middle recension 22 times. Altone, short recension once, middle recension 18. And aftois, short recension once, middle recension 14 times. These are function words that are really important. Whoever was dealing with the middle recension much more often preferred to use pronouns than the short recension. Now let me ask you a question. What is more likely? That the short recension was expanded upon and somebody really preferred to use the term alla over any other conjunction, or do you think that a monk went through and decided to remove 56 occurrences of the word alla in the 7-letter collection to abbreviate it or redact it down to the short recension? It doesn't really make sense when you look at it from that perspective. The next slide are words that are in the 7-letter collection and not in the 3-letter collection. And this is a pretty important set of words. Marcus Vincent, in his book, actually only does the letter alpha, the first letter of the Greek alphabet. And so there are some words here that you would probably know. For example, only in the middle recension, amen shows up, which is you guessed it, Greek word for amen. And the only one that really matters on this list is here, the Greek word anastasis. Shows up 13 times in the 7-letter collection, but does not show up a single time in the 3-letter collection. This is one of the most important words in the entire Greek language because it's the word for resurrection. So what's more likely, that as theological thought and theological, the New Testament becomes more widely spread and more popularized, and as things advance over the centuries, that people are using more theological terms such as resurrection? Or do you think it's more likely that an Egyptian monk decides to take the 7-letter collection, a Christian monk decides to remove all 13 occurrences of the word resurrection? It just doesn't really make sense. It makes much more sense that the 7-letter collection, as theological thought and writings developed, that they were added in at a later time. Okay, so the conclusion of Vincent's findings are this. It is much more likely that a later writer attempted to mimic the original writings of Ignatius by expanding old themes and creating new ones while not being able to conceal their own writing style. Those function words are totally based on personal preference. You can use them, you don't have to, but it is really difficult to hide your own writing preferences when you're mimicking somebody else's. It is unlikely that a much later redactor would go through and remove every mention of the term resurrection or remove 4 entire letters of the corpus. It's just unlikely. Okay, so now we're finally going to get to the examination of Christology. What we're going to do during this section is Jesus is called God a lot in the 7-letter collection. So we're not going to examine every single time that occurs. We're going to examine every single time that Jesus is called God in the 7-letter collection, where he could have equally been called God in the 3-letter collection, and we will examine that. So our first example is this. The salutation to the Ephesians. This is what it says in the 7-letter collection. Ignatius, the image bearer to the church at Ephesus in Asia, blessed with greatness through the fullness of God the Father, predestined before the ages for lasting and unchangeable glory forever, united and elect through genuine suffering by the will of the Father and of Jesus Christ, our God. Pretty explicitly calls Jesus God in the 7-letter collection. But what does it say in the 3-letter collection? Ignatius, who is Theophorus, which means God, it kind of means God-clad or something like that, to the church which is blessed in the greatness of God the Father and perfected by the will of the Father of Jesus Christ, our God. And so it doesn't say Jesus Christ, our God, but it's rather the will of the Father of Jesus Christ, who is our God. It seems pretty small, but it's an important distinction to make, and all of the other examples are much more explicit. For example, in Ephesians chapter 7, the 7-letter collection says this: there is only one physician who is both flesh and spirit, born and unborn, God and man, true life and death, both from Mary and from God, first subject to suffering, and then beyond it, Jesus Christ our Lord. That sounds pretty dang Catholic to me, okay? In the 3-letter collection, there is no chapter 7 in the Syriac. That's suspicious. In fact, Ephesians in the middle recension has several more chapters and over 1,000 more words. This is a huge dispariting factor. So what do you think? Do you think that an Egyptian monk took out this beautiful Catholic phrase, or do you think it's more likely that as theological thought and philosophy developed and New Testament writings developed, that it was added at a later time? I think that makes sense to me. Ephesians chapter 8. For our God, Jesus the Christ, was conceived by Mary according to God's plan, both from the seed of David and of the Holy Spirit. The 3-letter collection says this. There is no chapter 8 in the Syriac. You're going to notice a theme here, friends. Ephesians chapter 19, which is called the Star Hymn. It's a really weird chapter. Over a third of the words that are used in the 7-letter collection in the Star Hymn, over a third of them in that chapter are unique to Ignatius at all. It actually is a little bit of evidence for a second interpolation. In the 7-letter collection, it says this: when God appeared in human form to bring the newness of eternal life. Guess what the 3-letter collection says? This verse isn't in the short recension. Salutation to the Romans. I didn't put the full thing on here because the salutation to the Ephesians is the mouthful. Romans is worse. Jesus Christ is called God 2 times. I did the reading for you. In the 3-letter collection, Jesus is only called the Christ. Every time it's called Jesus Christ, our God, in the longer recension, it's only Jesus Christ in the short recension. And the Roman salutation in the middle recension is over 2 times longer than the short recension. In Romans chapter 3, it says this: for our God, Jesus Christ, is more visible now that he is in the Father. That sounds ethereal. And the 3-letter collection, it's totally absent from the text. In Polycarp chapter 8, I bid you farewell always in our God, Jesus Christ. Absent from the short recension ends 2 chapters earlier. So I gave every possible time that Jesus could have been called God in a 3-letter collection. that was presented in the seven-letter collection. Jesus is regularly called God in the middle recension. If you go pick up a copy of Apostolic Fathers, you'll see it's dozens of times over and over and over and over again. You'll see it. But in the three-letter collection, it's absent. So what's more likely to be a faithful second century text? The one that's full of Catholic anachronisms, full of these anachronistic was the word I was looking for. Thank you. Anachronistic additions to the text, or is it more likely that they were redacted as theology and time went on? It just doesn't make sense. So point number one is this: Lightfoot's monastic redaction theory does not stand well when the data and the history are carefully considered. When you do the forensic job that Marcus Vincent does, go through and look at word usage, look at he literally has graphs and things like that. I didn't bring out the graphs. I didn't want to really put you to sleep. But he has graphs and graphs and graphs of all this data, and when you look at it from this really forensic perspective, you can see what you really can't see on the surface. The monastic redaction theory does not stand well when all the data is carefully considered. 2, the middle recension cannot be trusted as the primary source of Ignatian text, and the short Syriac is more likely to be closer to the original material. And thirdly, the Christology of the three-letter collection is more likely to be from the second century and not the anachronistic language used in the seven-letter collection, as Christology developed over the first 4 centuries of church history. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor Massie, for that lucid presentation of a set of complex issues. We have a few questions here. The first is this: is it possible that some letters were lost in the Syrian monastery? What are your speculations in that regard?
I don't think so. I mean, a monk's primary job was to procure the text and to keep them safe. Since they were actually all found in the same monastery, I find it unlikely that was the case. In fact, I believe it's the letter to the Tarsians that you can actually found tacked on to the end of Polycarp in the three-letter collection. And so when you look at that, it's much more simple for somebody to take that and develop it into the rest of a full letter than it is for them to just redact it and kind of just smash it together. It's much more likely that the 3 Syriac texts that we have are the only ones that there are, because Puritan, they literally went and bought every available piece of paper from the Egyptian monastery. So I think it's very unlikely.
Thank you. Our next question: how certain is the back translation from Aramaic to Greek on which the word frequency charts comparing the 3-letter collection to the 7-letter collection are based?
That's an excellent question. The words that are used would be commonly known in the Greek text, and so as far as comparing the two, it's not very difficult to find a common word that could be shared by both Greek and Syriac. So, yeah, the work that Vincent does when to actually compare on the word usage would be based on the Syriac's most plausible counterpart in the Greek text. It's not that he's like purposely trying to mistranslate to show inaccuracies in frequency of usage, but he's doing, he's using a really solid baseline of Greek text.
Thank you. In your studies, have you come across any other theory other than the monastic redaction theory?
I have not. Yeah, again, people don't really question Lightfoot, so I have not really seen. The only other theory besides monastic redaction is that they're all fake. That's really the only other theory that exists. That the entire Ignatian corpus is all totally spurious, all fake, all from a much later time. In fact, I think Marcus Vincent probably believes that. So I have not found any other credible theory besides monastic redaction.
Right, a worthwhile option that should be put on the table, right?
Yeah, well, or rather, it's the monastic redaction theory is Lightfoot's theory that we should be challenging.
How can we get access to the 3-letter version of Ignatius letters in English?
Yeah, it's very hard. It's not popular. It's not a popular seller on Amazon. I did eventually find it. If I do have a copy on my computer, if you want a copy of it, come and talk to me and I'll email it to you, or I can show you where to get it online. It's actually quite difficult. It took me a long time to be able to find it. I just kept reading the 7-letter collection, didn't have any access to the 3-letter collection. So you can either buy a physical copy of Curitin's book on Amazon, or I believe you can go to like Google Books and get a copy.
Or visit your nearest monastery.
Yeah, your nearest, yeah, you're...
Ante-Nicene Fathers, Volume 1, if you didn't hear that. Our next question, speaking of books, is what is the name of Dr. Vincent's book, and how have other scholars responded to it?
It's only been out since 2019. I haven't seen really any other scholars reacting to it. The name of his book, that's an excellent question. If you give me a second, I can find it. Oh, you can all see this. Hi. No internet. It's called No Internet. Try checking the network cables, modem, and router. So that's the name of his book. I'll find
I suggest we Google it.
Yeah, just... It's a shorter recension. It's one where you can play the dinosaur game.
Yeah, excellent. And our last question is perhaps our most interesting for some of our members of our audience. Is there any evidence for or against the pre-existence of Christ in this presumably earlier collection?
Oh, that is a good question. One could argue that there might have been some type of incarnation theory. For example, the star hymn that shows up in Ephesians 19, even the shorter collection still has some kind of strange Gnostic, maybe pre-existence type language, but it doesn't have as strong as a foothold as in the 7-letter collection. In the 3-letter collection, you would see that Ignatius is pretty much, he seems like kind of a Unitarian Christian. In fact, he doesn't even seem to be that much of a theological, mind or thinker. He's just somebody who's writing some letters, apparently on his way to be dismembered by lions in the Colosseum, and he's just writing letters of encouragement. So Ignatius is not a terribly theological thinker. He has some theology in there, but you see much more of that type of theology in the 7-letter collection. And to answer the previous question, the name of the book is Writing the History of Early Christianity, from reception to retrospection. Now, I will tell you this. It was the most expensive book I ever bought, so don't buy it. Just, if you have a question, just ask me. I'll look it up for you, okay? But yeah, it was the most expensive book that I ever bought for only needed the last 100 pages. So,
thank you, Pastor.
Thank you.
Let's give a round of applause for making it.